My name is Aine McGlynn.
And I'm Lizz Bryce. For most of our careers, we've been deep in the weeds of charities and technology, but most interested in the people who use it. I'm SVP Community and Strategic Initiatives at Canada Helps, Canada's largest online donation and fundraising platform, and a charity ourselves.
And I run a small consultancy focused on the digital needs of small charities. We're your hosts of Digital Comfort Zone, a super not scary technology podcast for the people powering nonprofits in Canada.
In 2023, Canada Helps launched Charity Growth Academy to help you kickstart your digital transformation. Now we're excited to bring you this podcast that rarely talks about your tech stack and instead focuses on the people who make it work each day. Today we're talking about persuasion and buy-in. Anya, when was the last time you had to convince someone of something that they were resistant to doing?
Ooh, I have a good one for this. So this past weekend, I was guiding some clients doing outdoor rock climbing. Side note, I moonlight as a rock climbing instructor. So I was teaching the student how to rappel. So that is like to lean backwards over a cliff edge and trust that her harness and rope would keep her safe as she lowered herself down to the bottom of the cliff. And obviously she was a little afraid and she was unconvinced that she would survive this whole experience. So
fair.
Fair. So I picked up on that and I saw that resistance. So I demonstrated the skill for her first. And I showed her like all the backups that were built into the system. I showed her how her rappel device was designed to catch her. I explained to her that the rope that she was attached to was tested to hold 5,000 pounds of weight. And so she took all that in and she listened. And with all that new information, she stepped away from the cliff edge and she lowered herself to the ground and was so delighted with herself. But we had to kind of overcome that resistance. And I had to use a lot of proof to convince her that she was going to be safe. So it was a win all around. How about you?
I mean, I don't moonlight as a climbing instructor. I do moonlight as a parent, though.
Okay, great.
And the thing that comes to mind is my daughter, when she was about 3 years old, we were sitting at the table and she had asked us, like, can you go get my water bottle? And trying to be a good parent, we're like, no, you can get your own water bottle. You're a very capable young woman. It's in the kitchen. She didn't like it that much. She was like, okay, fine. And we continue eating. And then a few minutes later, she's like, can I have a glass of milk? And we're like, oh, okay, well, she can't go get her own milk. So I'll get up and go get her some milk. And I get a few feet into the kitchen and I hear her calling behind me. And while you're in there, can you get my water bottle?
So crafty.
So crafty and both, worried and impressed.
Wow.
And I think, what makes this so interesting and relevant for what we're talking about is about somebody knowing their end goal and knowing they need to bring people along to get there, even if they don't know they're being brought along.
Yes.
And it's really clever in some of these situations where you might have at work where people are resistant and you need to set them up to follow the path that you're laying for them.
That's really interesting. And I feel like our two anecdotes show two different sides of persuasion or buy-in. Mine was like proof-based, right? Like, let me show you all of this empirical evidence as to why the outcome is going to be as I tell you it is going to be. And then with that empirical evidence, the person is like, okay, I'm convinced. I will do the thing. And yours demonstrates this other opportunity for persuasion and buy-in, which is, okay, what is my goal? They won't do what I want them to do, but if I can shift the request, then I can get them to do that other thing. And in doing that other thing, I'm giving them the opportunity now to do the thing that I initially wanted them to do. So it's really interesting because both are really good tactics, right?
They both get you where you want to be. And part of this skill is going to be about reading the situation or maybe testing different approaches out.
Exactly.
And we probably hear similar things from charities that we work with. Do you have any examples of that?
Yeah, for sure. So, every week we like to connect our theme with a real world charity experience. So, talking about persuasion and buy-in, I want to tell you a little bit about a client that I worked with. So this person, my direct contact, had authority to make investments in digital technologies, They had received a grant to do so and to hire people specifically to help those new digital technologies that were being rolled out. But the problem was that the rest of the leadership team weren't really bought into the idea of the organization becoming digitally enabled. And in fact, they were pretty resistant to change. The bookkeeper specifically was like, nope, don't want to learn a new accounting system, won't learn it. And this is in spite of the fact that this person had experienced a flood in their basement that wiped out like 7 years of paper-based financial records. Even that, nope, not convinced that moving to the cloud is the right thing to do. And so like that misalignment between one set of priorities to become more digital and the actual leadership practice and readiness caused all of this interpersonal tension, delayed the timelines for implementation, created frustration all around because buy-in and consensus hadn't been achieved before they took those steps, right?
The phrase buy-in appears almost 24 times in the comments of the Digital Skills Report.
Wow.
And resistance appears 10 times. People know that they need board and leader and funder buy-in to invest not just the dollars, but also the time into using technology better. And buy-in begins with making a case, and then it continues by using persuasion tactics to convince folks that your position is the correct one.
Power of persuasion and all that. Yeah, for sure. And I think, part of achieving buy-in is being curious about what those resistances are, right? And that curiosity can be a helpful tool because once you know what that individual's blocks are or resistances are, then you can sort of craft or anticipate a way to overcome those challenges, right?
Well, lucky for us, our guest today is a master of persuasion. Philip Haid is the CEO of Public Inc., a full-service social impact marketing agency. Public Inc. works with brands who want to be good corporate citizens. Public has to convince these brands of how to position themselves and their products. And those brands have to convince consumers to make a choice that's in their best interest and the best interest of the social impact goal they're trying to have. A whole lot of persuasion and convincing happening.
Welcome, Phil. Delighted to have you here today with us. Very appreciative of your time. We're going to jump right into it, if that's okay.
Yeah, appreciate being here.
Oh, yeah. So one of the things I was doing when I was excited about having you as a guest is I was looking at your LinkedIn profile, of course, and Public's LinkedIn page. And one of the things that stood out to me was suggesting that asking what's in it for me is not a dirty question. So I'm interested in that idea. So how do you identify what's in it for someone when you're trying to make a case to them to invest in an idea or in change? Yeah, let's start there.
I'll start by answering it by saying that question of what's in it for me isn't a dirty question comes from a place that so often when we are trying to communicate and engage people in social and environmental issues, we quickly jump to the collective benefit, right? This is about greening our planet. This is about improving communities. And this conversation we're going to have is all about persuasion and how we engage people and get them to take action. And I think I'm starting here because I think the mistake that gets made so often is we focus on the collective benefit, not the individual benefit. And so much of our work, even though we live exclusively in social and environmental issues, is to actually say that's the wrong starting point. If you're going to persuade people, you actually need to start with what's in it for them, right? How does this actually drive a motivation, a behavior, a value for the individual? And then you can layer on the collective benefit. But if you look at most of the marketing that happens on the environment as an example, almost all of it's about helping the planet. And what it does is it tells the consumer that the product maybe isn't as good as other products that aren't bettering the planet. And so it actually works against you. And so when we think about this question about how does this actually generate benefit to me, that motivation it can be for all kinds of reasons. It could be that the benefit is you're looking for recognition, right? The benefit could be that you're trying to align your values. The benefit could be that, it makes you feel good inside. It's like an ego driver, or it's just right? There's all kinds of different buttons, attitudinal or behavioral that you can push. But the key is to actually think about what those things are, because they are different for different people, but start there as opposed to just constantly play to this collective benefit.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think what you're getting at there also is like, what is the value at the heart of the individual who you're trying to convince, right? What matters to them? And the best way to do that is to be curious, right? Is to be open and to ask. Literally working with a client right now who is struggling to bring a leadership team through digital transformation. And we have been focusing on all of the wrong ways to persuade them, which is efficiency gains and transparency and collaboration. But for each individual member of that leadership team, that's not motivating to them. Them as individuals who have to embrace that change and learn new skills, we had to find other mechanisms to try and bring them along. And that started with asking them questions about what mattered to them about the work that they do. So I think that's really great.
So there's lots of commonality in what motivates people, right? But there's also lots of difference in people because people are so different. So actually trying to understand what is that, whether it's an intrinsic or extrinsic motivation, like what is driving you to want to, whether that is introduction of a new technology that you're trying to input into a new system, or whether it's kind of examples I was giving in a moment ago, really understanding what makes people tick and what they need, and being actually explicit about that and actually owning that and asking, curious questions as opposed to making assumptions. And then not being shy from saying, okay, well, we need to understand what that individual need is about, but then also how does that connect to the collective benefit and need, right? And so I think we don't spend enough time finding those things out. Often when we think about target audience, we get asked about. The answer will come back and say, "This is people, basically the general public," right? Well, the general public isn't an audience. It's too big. It's too broad. How are you going to find the commonality about what motivates the general public? I mean, that's wildly so you have to get more specific about it. And so I think we let ourselves off the hook too often in that we're not spending the time to really understand what motivates individuals or what motivates groups, and then not being shy to say what's in it for them, because there has to be something in it for them, because there's a very small percentage of the people who will do something because it's just the right thing to do. And I'm not trying to malign to say that people are all selfish, not at all. But I think it's a combination of the self-interest and the collective interest.
I think there might be, my sort of guess here is that because so much of the work of nonprofits and charities is about self-sacrifice, that's a big mindset shift to think about even considering needs that are not about your big mission kind of thing. And it's part of the challenge in this is convincing people and organizations to invest in themselves and invest in this work that either they're not seeing the value of, or it seems like it's going to be too hard or too expensive. And so I'm wondering, all those ideas about audience and bigger messages, you could go really broad with that. But if we were thinking even at a smaller level and internally, how do you go about sort of doing that motivational interviewing and understanding those needs that they might have to really get at to the resistance? And then how would you overcome that resistance?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Let me just start by saying that sometimes you can't overcome the resistance, right? I think we have this sense or this belief that all objections can be overcome. But actually, in my experience, at least that's not the case. But most of the time, or a big part of the time, you absolutely can. And so part of understanding, part of persuading, I think is trying to get at the root of what are the objections, right? What are the barriers to the individual? And this could apply to any kind of issue, internal or external. So, just some examples, is the barrier, is the resistance to buy-in, is that about risk tolerance, where what you're proposing is just too risky for them and there's just way too much downside relative to what they perceive to be the upside, right? Is one example. Is why they're resisting that they're saying, this is just going to be too much work. And I don't think I'm not going to personally benefit by all this work, right? You're putting more on my plate and I'm already working too hard, right? Is that what's happened here? Is there resistance because the person doesn't believe they can sell it up the ladder because it's too big a financial or a financial resource kind of ask of the organization, right? That's another significant barrier that can happen. There can be barriers around actually just not liking the idea, the direction that's being proposed. And so even though they feel like they need to do it because there's sort of the consensus of that direction, they're resisting it because they don't actually believe it. They think it's the wrong approach. And so all of those are very different barriers. So if you take a more like appreciative inquiry kind of model where you're trying to understand, not to manipulate, but to really understand what is getting in the way of someone's decision making or their just like openness to an idea. If you take that curiosity and that sort of appreciative inquiry where you're trying to understand what is standing in the way and where they're coming from, it usually will unearth the answer. Now, you may not like the answer you get, and that's why sometimes the answer is it's not going to work. But I think we all could serve to get a lot more curious about the people we interact with, the markets we're trying to engage, the donor we're trying to convince, right? I think we get too much in transaction mode and persuasion mode, but we miss the step of actually getting really curious to unlock how we might persuade in a way where it's truly a win-win.
That's great. Yeah, I think there's a big relationship as well between persuasion and trust, right? Which I'd love us to get into. But the first thing that kind of strikes me is, as part of Charity Growth Academy, we've created all of these resources that folks can use. And one of them that we wrote was getting board buy-in or leadership buy-in for investing in digital. And it's full of all of this empirical evidence as to why an organization should make this investment. And as I'm hearing you talk, I'm like, oh, well, I mean, that's one part of the puzzle, sure. And that's going to work on one type of a person who is like highly logical and is like, okay, well, A plus B equals C. So therefore we will invest. But the reality is that instead what you have is 8 board members who have varying different, degrees of comfort with technology or, innovation or risk. You've got leaders who have their own individual relationships with numeracy and data literacy, right? So it's making me think, not that resource is not useful, but that resource there needs to be sort of a companion piece to it, which is this conversation. How do we build our own curiosity to reveal, what are those resistances and as such address them? So I guess if you could maybe sort of speak a little bit to the difference between trying to convince someone with evidence versus convincing someone in a way that they may not even be aware that they've been enacted upon, right? Where they're just like, maybe it feels like it occurred to them as the idea.
I love the question. And to me, the starting point is a recognition that we are emotional creatures and that we make most decisions based on our emotion. And then we sort of justify the action or the decision with reason. Now, that's overstated because it's obviously a combination of rational, logical thinking and evaluation and analysis. So I'm not trying to downplay that. But ultimately, we are emotive creatures who make decisions for an emotional reason. And then we justify or validate the decision we kind of made emotionally through our logic and our analysis. And I think that's a really important starting point, because if we believe that to be true and we acknowledge that, then to what you were saying a moment ago, then the starting point can't just be about the logic. It can't just be about making the rational argument for why taking this action or believing this thing is the right thing to do. And so if you're trying to persuade people, yes, of course you have to make a solid argument, and you have to have data, and you have to have research and proof points to validate why your argument or your idea makes sense. But I wonder how much time we're actually spending and thinking about that person, if it's an individual or that group of people, and what actually motivates them. What are their attitudes and behaviors that, those buttons that we can push? And I don't mean this in a manipulative way. I mean this in an authentic way, where you're saying, I know they care about this, but they care about a lot of things. How am I going to get them to care about this particular thing? And so when you start to think about, well, what do I know about them? What do I understand about them? What makes them tick? What kinds of decisions do I believe they often make, and for what set of reasons? And you start to get into how they, and this is part of the interpretation, but you start to think about the attitudes and the behaviors of that individual, that collective, it takes you to a very different place, right? Because then the answer to the persuasion may have nothing to do with a logical argument, everything to do with pushing in a button which is around humor, or it may be pushing a button which is about making them really feel it, right? Getting them to touch that emotive core that, makes them feel really sad about the state of X issue, right? Or it might be that you actually push the button to intentionally, again, I don't mean this as manipulation, but intentionally get them to get angry or get anxious or get worried about the future or something. All of those emotions are really critical and powerful in driving the persuasion to get the outcome that you're looking for. Once you've hooked them with the emotion, you have to then backfill and demonstrate that the idea or the offering is of value. Most of the time it starts with the idea and the argument, the rational argument for why. But imagine if we flipped it and we started the other way and we really hooked them into what we think is relevant to them. And then we make the argument. I think we might get a lot further.
All that makes sense that you're saying about tapping into the emotion. And I think it's often a technique that's used in charities, particularly causes that are easier to show the emotion of. In this instance, our cause is convincing people to invest in digital. And because we have you here, what's the emotive argument we make to a board member or a leader to say, you need to start embracing technology the way that businesses would or for-profits would?
I don't have the answer, but I'm going to give you a multitude of answers to that, right? And maybe one of these is accurate, and Liz, you'll tell me if it's not. But if you're making the argument for a greater investment in technology as Canada helps, so one approach is to say, well, does the fear of missing out, does that motivate? You see this in sales techniques and such, right? That your competitors are doing this, the market is going there. You are going to miss out if you don't move in this direction, right? That is an argument. That is an emotive argument that gets you saying, oh, wow, I don't want to miss out on that. So the fear of missing out is an approach, right? There's another, and I'm not advocating for any of these, they're just different. There's another one that says, actually start with the emotive approach that says, if we are going to be a modern, leading, top of the line organization, we are completely missing the boat, right? We are showing our weakness by not investing in this. So you're actually playing to a bit of an angst, and it's a little bit of a put down almost, right? It's saying like, smart people understand that this is what you do, right? You're playing to a different emotion there, right? You're challenging their competency. So that's where you might make them angry, but it could motivate them to say, you know what, Liz is making a point, right? There's another approach that says emotively, well, let's actually start to show them examples of how an investment in technology changed the world. So rather than the rational argument about what it's going to do for the business and the ROI and so on, you're actually talking about the whole reason why people are engaged with Canada Helps is because they actually want to make Canada, right, a more giving and more generous, right? We want there to be more support for the kind of change that we're all looking for. So if you can actually get me excited as a board member or whoever it is to see the possibility, you're tapping into a different kind of emotion, right? So those are just three, and there's others. All of those are emotive arguments that have a rationale behind them, but they actually play to something about the individual that may or may not resonate depending on who they are.
And we'll just give a disclaimer that if anybody listening to this takes Phil's advice and makes their boss really angry, that's not on us.
That's up to you.
That's right.
No, that's up to you.
You can blame me.
But that actually does lead really nicely into sort of a next thought or question that I wanted to bring up. There's a book that I read a couple of years ago that I think is really helpful on this topic. It's called Conflict is Not Abuse by Sarah Schulman. And I think it's really helpful for our discussion today. And it's about the fact that in conflict, we're not automatically abusing or being unkind to each other. We're simply acting from our respective positions, values, as we've talked about, understandings of the world, realities, and that part of persuasion sometimes means that you have to pass through conflict. And conflicts that are resolved are typically resolved because people leave their egos kind of out of it, right? Like there's no resolution of conflict if we're sort of sitting in our ego and our hurt. So I'm interested, I'm sure that you've had examples, Phil, of working with a client and trying to convince them, and there's maybe some conflict. There's definitely some ego. And yeah, interested to hear how you work through conflict, how perhaps you can even use ego as a strength, or where does it come into play when you're trying to convince folks of an idea?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I would start by saying this might seem sort of contradictory, but I find in the workplace and in organizations, people tend to be very conflict avoidant. And I say that might seem contradictory because when you look at the world, there's so much conflict, right? There's so much people who we seem to be in a state of the world at the moment. This is obviously an exaggerated macro comment, but we seem to be living in this world where we're so ready to tell the other person why they are wrong, right? And from cancel culture to, just the conflict where we just need to basically ram down their throats that you're right and they're wrong. We're seeing that a lot in the world. And yet, I think in so many organizations, clients we've worked with, people we encounter, there's so much conflict avoidance. So there's it can be a lot of passive aggressive. But what you're talking about, Aine, is about actually dealing with conflict as a healthy part of how you engage to persuade to get to better outcomes. And I actually think there's an important place for it. But we have not been taught how to engage in conflict in a very respectful, constructive way. And I think it's a real problem. So the role, I think, is to actually think about how to engage people where it doesn't feel like I'm putting your back up against the wall, right? That I'm not getting you to get all angry and upset, but actually realize that conflict is about opposing points of view. And I always say to my team and people we work with, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. So a difference of opinion can very easily escalate into how people perceive conflict, which is this really high animosity and so on, as opposed to saying, okay, we clearly have a difference of opinion. Back to what we were talking about earlier, let's get curious about why you think the way you think, why I think the way I do, and let's actually explore how we might come together, because it's clear in working together on this project that we actually have real alignment of values, right? We actually want the same outcome, and we're trying to work in a similar manner, but clearly there's a conflict here. So tell me more about why you believe what you believe and what shaped that. And then let me tell you, right? How often, in your experience does that happen, right? Almost never. And so I think that's where there's an opportunity to think about how to embrace conflict in a way that can be really productive, right? I mean, the old expression that, a diamond is pressure on a rock, right? On a stone. We need pressure. Like what makes for amazing results, amazing work is when you have opposing forces coming together to try to work through it. That's an incredibly powerful force we shouldn't shy away from. But we have to bring a respect. We have to bring a understanding. We have to bring a kindness to that kind of discussion. And I think ego often just gets in the way. You asked about ego. I mean, I think you can play to someone's ego, but when you do, you're really just trying to pacify them as opposed to trying to find a solution on the other end that's actually a win-win. And that's the last point I would make, is I think too often we're still trying to convince the other person of why you're right and they're wrong, as opposed to saying, if they clearly have a strong belief in something, and I have a strong belief in something, is there a common ground? And how do we get to that? Right? But that takes work. That's not easy. But unfortunately, we want too many shortcuts in life.
I could go on and on and on about ego and conflict, but Liz, let's move on to your next question.
So Phil, I think for our last question, I'm curious about the relationship between trust and buy-in and how you might need to meet the person you're trying to convince where they're at.
Yeah, it's a really important question. And I think it's one where we gloss over it too quickly. Trust is critical, as we all know, to any relationship. And when you're trying to persuade influence someone on a decision. If you have a high level of trust, it's obvious. It's very easy. In fact, what I'm kind of amazed by some of the time is that where there's high levels of trust, oftentimes people will be persuaded by your argument or your solution, and they won't even do the due diligence to know if you've actually could back it up, right? I mean, that's how powerful trust can be.
Wow, yes.
The converse is also true, right? Which is where you have not established a relationship yet and you're just getting to know each other, the trust is very low. And so you might have all the goods, you might have all the experience and expertise, but the person has had a bad experience. And of course, we bring all of our previous experiences and our baggage into these interactions. And so the opposite happens where you're making a really important point or you're making a really great offering, but the person's hedging and they don't know because it's like, well, I haven't had this great experience. And we've had that experience a lot with people where they're bringing a bad experience into, and it's coloring how we're going to do it. So to spend time and to really think about how to build that trust is a really important facet. The problem for anybody listening is that it's not something you can build quickly, right? Trust just doesn't happen. So you do need to look for the shortcuts, but there are shortcuts. So one shortcut to trust is to demonstrate your experience or your expertise that makes them feel like, okay, this person knows what they're doing. They've seen this before. They've done that before. That is a good shortcut. Sometimes a shortcut to trust is just a feeling that I like this person. I think I can do business with that person, or I think I can work with this person. And so that likability factor, whether we like it or not, is a very, very powerful force as well. That can be a shortcut to trust. But oftentimes there isn't a shortcut. So it's not a great answer in the sense that it is really, really important. It can actually, in some cases, work against you because you can be too trustful. In other cases, it can work for you and against you, depending on that relationship. But I think probably most importantly is you need to think about, how would I build a trust with this relationship or this person or this group of people, and bring an authenticity to it? Because I think too often we're trying to find the persuasion, but maybe it's not as authentic as it could be. And I think whether people are conscious of it or not, you can see through it, right? And so I always say to my team, I say to people, always let your passion come through, right? Don't pretend to know something you don't. Like, all the adages that we know, like the honesty, the transparency, like those things really matter in building those trusting relationships. But it's not foolproof and it's not easy.
That's fantastic, Phil. This conversation has been really helpful, and I'm sure that our listeners are going to take a lot away from it. So, you can use the guide that has the empirical evidence to convince your leaders about transforming digitally, and then you can also pair it, hopefully, with some of the lessons that Phil has left us with about curiosity, values, meeting a person where they are. So, thank you very much for your time today, Philip. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Phil.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It was a lot of fun.
That was a fantastic conversation with Phil. I am reeling, sitting in a ton of great insights that he's left us with. Is there one that jumps out for you, Liz, that you want to kick off with?
Yeah, that was such a good experience. There were so many insights in what Phil shared and such an amazing level of expertise that I think most organizations are never going to hear. And so I'm really appreciative of his time. The thing that really stood out to me was when he was talking about people bringing their bad experiences. And I think when we think of technology, and I know you did research on this, Aine, people often have a lot of shame about it. And if they're people whose jobs didn't involve technology in the first place, or they don't understand technology, there's a lot of baggage they might be bringing. And for so many people that work in nonprofits, they're there because of the mission. And they're there because they care about it, and not really because they want to know how to automate things. Maybe some people do, and that's amazing too. But I think it's important when you're trying to, or when you're experiencing resistance, to take a step back and think about why they might be resistant. And it might be about bad experiences in the past. And maybe think about ways that you can ease some of that fear or uncertainty around technology.
Absolutely. Yeah, I thought that was one of the biggest takeaways for me was the person-based approach to persuasion and understanding what is at the heart of people's resistance to change or resistance to investing in technology. A client example that I mentioned in the intro about someone who is resisted to bookkeeping software, the conversation with Phil is making me want to revisit that resistance and connect with that person who's rejecting digital technologies in that way and understand what's at the root of that rejection and that resistance. I think it's probably something about, this is an older person. This is someone who has been in this volunteer leadership role for a long time, who is planning to exit. So I think it's probably something to do with relevance, with, attachment to a role, with aging. These are really like deep kind of complex human things that are happening for this person. And Phil's insights have made me think about approaching that conversation a little bit differently. So I'm excited to give that a try. I'll report back. I'll let you know if they're using QuickBooks Online by next week.
Well, they'll probably owe Phil a cookie at the very least if he solves that problem for you. But
100%.
I think what's so great about, both in Phil and, how we interact with him and how I've interacted with him before, and what he shared about his team is the authenticity, right? And trust. And we often think about persuasion as trying to put one over on people. And, like we're talking about in this about like, one, you have to believe what you're selling and you have to build an authentic relationship with people and build that trust. But also like sometimes you might not be able to persuade them. Like sometimes it just might not be a good fit. And that's okay too.
Yeah, I think that that's a good takeaway as well. What if there is no convincing of your board or there is no convincing of your funder that these are the right investments? I mean, at some point, you kind of have to say, well, this is maybe not going to work and move on. And that's okay too. If you're a leader in that position, you will find an organization who is excited to bring that vision into existence. And if you're confronting resistance that is so concrete that there's no possibility of getting to the other side of it, like it's okay to say, well, I tried, and to kind of move on, right? Not before trying a values-based approach. I think that's really, really powerful. One of the other things that I loved about our conversation with Phil was talking about the speed at which trust is built, and it's typically quite slow. Unless you have some other intangibles at play, right? He talked about likability. He talked about humor. He talked about sort of disarming people in different ways that help them understand that you are a person that they want to work with. You are a person who is intelligent. You are a person who should be listened to. So maybe that involves, for you, if you're trying to convince your leaders of this investment, maybe that involves loosening up your pitch a little bit, right? Maybe that involves having a coffee with the folks that you're trying to convince in more of a friendly way, having them get to know you, right? There's a person-to-person authenticity there, as you just mentioned, that can help bring people along, that I think all of us could try out.
Absolutely. Those are all really great points. And I'm glad that we could share them today. So to everybody who's joined us, thank you for listening to Digital Comfort Zone. We hope we kept it fun and not scary. And there's some really great takeaways from today's episode that should help you with some specific tactics to get buy-in from those folks you may need to bring along for this journey.
The best way that you can get started on achieving buy-in for digital transformation is to check out Charity Growth Academy. You can start your assessment today, right now. Like, even as you're listening to me talk, you can go and start it. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating. This helps other folks discover the show.
And thank you to our amazing guest, Phil Haid from Public, our podcast producers, Christian Robillard and Richard Villeneuve at Purpose Podcasting. This podcast has been a production of Charity Growth Academy by Canada Helps, and support for Charity Growth Academy has been generously provided by MasterCard ChangeWorks and MasterCard Impact Fund.